let's get started. I'm going to introduce Jamie, and then we will go forward. All right, this is my first time actually meeting Jamie in the flesh, but she is also a force of nature, and I think you will discover that through her presentation. She's worked at the intersection of documentary film and social justice organizing for the past decade. She is currently the executive director of Peace is Loud, which is an amazing organization, a nonprofit founded by filmmaker Abigail Disney that uses the power of storytelling to advance social movement building, with a focus on supporting women who are leading their communities in confronting violence, from acts of war to systemic injustice. Peace is Loud has led impact campaigns for films, including Pray the Devil Back to Hell, which all of my students are required to see, The Uncondemned, The Hunting Ground, and the celebrated 5-part series Women, War, and Peace, which is just a fantastic series, seen by over 13 million people on PBS in 2011, and has been used as an organizing tool in 87 countries on all 7 continents. Jamie was previously Community Engagement and Education Manager for the PBS series POV, where she worked on broadcast campaigns for over 40 feature documentary films. A filmmaker by background, Jamie serves on the mentorship board for Northwestern University's MFA program in documentary film, and her own recent film, Shivani, is that how you pronounce it? Premiered at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City in 2018. A big welcome to Jamie.
All right. Thank you, Valerie, and thank you to the Bush School for having me and for convening such an incredible group of thought leaders here in the room to, as Dean Welsh said, really, broaden our perspectives on the women, peace, and security field. And thank you to Megan, who is here next to me, trying to, oh good, yes, pull up the PowerPoint. Okay. But I want to begin this morning by telling a story from a few weeks ago when I found myself caught in sort of a strange balancing act. At a dinner with 20 strangers and a nervously tapping foot, I was trying to keep a plate of chicken steady on my lap. It had been pouring rain all day, which I thought meant guests would certainly cancel because this was New York, and even in the best of weather, you can expect a pretty significant drop-off. But to my surprise and also slight dismay, every single person who RSVP'd came. With their umbrellas, galoshes, and all. And so this meant we were short a place. So as one of the co-hosts of the gathering, I did what I thought a good co-host should do, and I took a seat outside the table, thus the chicken on my lap and the balancing act. A few colleagues and I had hatched a plan that led to this evening. The idea was to invite 20 news editors to the home of Peace is Loud's founder, Abby Disney. We would share a home-cooked meal together and have a conversation about how the news media can better integrate women's voices into coverage of conflict and the consequences of not doing it well. And here they all were, 20 editors from some of the most prestigious publications in journalism, gathered around the dinner table to tell us how they think and what they think. It was an incredible opportunity to understand how decisions are made by people who have deep impact in shaping the public opinion of the masses. I'm used to often being one of the younger people in the room at events like this, and I can mostly hold my own, I think. But I won't lie that evening, I felt intimidated by the stature of the group of people around the table. As the dinner began, editors, they started sharing examples of stories that they were especially proud of, that they viewed as successful in giving equal representation to women, while also hitting high click rates, which is a reality that any journalist in 2018 has to face. The stories they cited were really excellent stories about maternal health and mortality, sexual violence and war, FGM. I had read many of these stories, and I have deep respect for the reporters and editors behind those stories. Some of these stories were done by women's issues beat writers, others by international or foreign policy desks or health desks. But wherever they were sourced from, it was clear to me that these examples were viewed around the table as the stories that impact women. There is no doubt that maternal health, FGM, and sexual violence impact women. But as I listened to these examples, I felt internally conflicted about the point of view I was hearing. I started wondering why the stories that impact women are so often limited to women's bodies. Even around a dinner table of 17 women and only 3 men, these were the women's issues of the day. I wondered, what would it look like if men's issues were limited to their bodies? What would those stories be? Is there even a fitting comparison? And by the laughs in the audience, I think, no, there's not, right? So my foot was really going at this point, and my plate was nearly falling off my lap, and I put it under my chair. I had barely touched my chicken, and I stepped up, and from the periphery of the room, I asked the table, I said, what stories don't impact women? Peace is Loud Senior Women, Peace and Security Advisor, Maria Riley, was at the dinner with me. And together we challenged the group around the table to widen their definitions, in particular of the issues that exist at the nexus of women, war, and peace. We talked about women peace builders and the importance of representing women as active agents of change and not just victims of human rights abuses. We also talked about the importance of equally sourcing women in their stories, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the smart thing to do as a journalist. Not just striving for accuracy and representation. How are you sure you're getting the full story when you're missing the perspective of 50% of the population? We explained that women's rights and their full and equal participation in society is critical for maintaining peace, not just for women, but for everyone. That all issues impact women, not just issues about their bodies, and that women's actions, their contributions to peace and security, seen and unseen, most definitely impact men. We were met with some blank stares in the room, but on we went. We talked about what we know to be true, that more and more research shows that when women influence peace processes, a peace agreement is more likely to be reached, and the agreement is more likely to last. We talked about the groundbreaking research from right here at Texas A&M, from Valerie Hudson and the Women's Stats Project, that shows us that gender equality is a greater predictor of peace than a society's wealth, levels of democracy, or religion. Valerie and her colleagues have shown us how in post-conflict societies, improving gender equality in family law, in a woman's right to inherit property, or minimum age of marriage, for example, can actually provide a pathway to societal stability. We know that a gender lens can help us better understand the drivers of conflict and pillars of peace, and that despite their gross underrepresentation in peace and security processes, women's perspectives matter. They matter as a foundation for social justice, and they matter for peace writ large. I think there was ultimately agreement on these points for most of our dinner guests, and it was a good sign that folks lingered for over an hour after the dinner officially came to an end. And perhaps most importantly, there was general consensus that the conversation should continue, and it will, thanks to the generous support of our partners at Our Secure Future. And I tell this story because I think it begs a very important question that we as a women, peace, and security community need to be asking ourselves as we tell the story of women, war, and peace in our work. Who narrates the world? The stories we hear and consume shape our worldview, our values, the way we interact with one another. And how those stories are told and who tells them is a really important piece of this. Representations change based on who is telling the story and who is sourced in the story. Even how we talk about representation matters. I'm going to be giving you some examples and pragmatic takeaways later in my remarks, some lessons I've learned from my own work. But I want to ask you all now to think about how often in your research or advocacy you use the language of underrepresentation when talking about marginalized communities. What happens when you replace just a few of those references with references of communities that are overrepresented? Suddenly, the center of power shifts. At Peace is Loud, we shift power by challenging dominant media narratives about the role of women in peace and security movements. Our organization was created because we found that there really weren't many conflict stories out there with women playing a role other than victim. We saw that peace and security stories were so often stories about violent conflict. And these stories were so often being told by men, they were about men. It's a story of war, the combatants and perpetrators, and that is, for the most part, a man's story. What we found is that the stories about women and the stories about building peace so often overlap, and they're so often missing from the narrative. We saw this firsthand with Pray the Devil Back to Hell, the film by our founder, Abby Disney and Ginny Redeker, a film that's part of Peace is Loud's origination story. And I know that many of you in this room have seen that film. For those of you who haven't, Pray chronicles the story of the Liberian women who came together to end a bloody civil war and bring peace to their country. Thousands of women, ordinary mothers, grandmothers, aunts, daughters, Christian and Muslim, they came together to pray for peace. And they staged a silent protest outside of the presidential palace. Armed only with white t-shirts and the courage of their convictions, they demanded a resolution to the country's civil war. Their actions were a critical element in bringing about an agreement during the stalled peace talks. When Abby and Ginny embarked on production, it was incredibly difficult for them to find any footage of what the women in Liberia had done. It just didn't exist. The combat footage, however, was extremely easy to come by. They were drowning in hours of the most disturbing images of blood and gore and child soldiers. When they asked journalists who covered the war why they didn't film the women protesting, the journalists said, "We saw them, but they looked so pathetic. How could they be important?" Eventually, co-producer Johanna Hamilton tracked down Charles Taylor's former presidential videographer, who had buried his masters and had in fact filmed the women, including their eventual meeting with Charles Taylor. This is the footage you see in the film. It's the only known footage of that meeting that exists, and the only known footage of the protests. Some of the first public screenings of Pray the Devil Back to Hell were for women's grassroots organizations around the world. And Abby and Ginny found pretty quickly that the story of the women in Liberia was a universal story. What the women had done and what had been represented. Whether in Colombia, South Korea, Bosnia, Kosovo, there were women everywhere who were playing vital roles in their communities' resistance movements. In the words of Northern Irish activist Bronagh Hinds, it wasn't that women were being written out of history, they were never written in. Peace is Loud was created to write women into the main narrative. Since our founding, we've used film and stories to advance social justice movement building, with a focus on representing women who are leading their communities in confronting violence from acts of war to systemic injustices. One of the women in Pray the Devil Back to Hell says, "Peace is not an event, peace is a process." And we exist in that spirit, to acknowledge that peace is loud and peace is messy. We're promoting an understanding that peace is dynamic and ever-changing, and that without the inclusion of women, real peace is impossible. And we've worked in partnership with so many of you in this room on our work, in particular on Pray the Devil Back to Hell and the series Women, War, and Peace, which was transformed into a training and organizing tool for your students, your communities, your constituents. The series was seen, as Dr. Hudson shared, by 13 million PBS viewers across America and integrated into the work of groups in 87 countries on all 7 continents, including Antarctica. Very proud of that. So due to popular demand, we will be back next March on PBS. I'm very happy to share with a second season of Women, War, and Peace. It is a brand new series of 4 films that write women into the narrative of conflicts in Northern Ireland, Palestine, Egypt, Bangladesh, and Haiti. So I want to show you a very short teaser for the new series. This is the first time this version is going to be screened publicly. You'll see scenes from a film about a network of Palestinian women activists that emerged in the spring of 1988 to lead a nonviolent social movement. You'll hear from women who played a critical role in brokering the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. You'll see clips from a film that profiles an all-female police force of 160 officers in Bangladesh who joined a year-long peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And you'll see women activists in Egypt on a quest for social justice and freedom following the Arab Spring.
survived Mubarak's rule, SCAF's rule, Morsi's government, and now back to a government backed by the army. And the same activists are being arrested and tried. It's not hard to remember what I wanted during the revolution, because what I wanted then is what I want now, freedom. The demands that were chanted sums it all up: rep, freedom, and social justice, including fighting for women's rights specifically.
The British and Irish governments have announced a firm date for the start of all party negotiations on the Northern Ireland peace process.
We've got to do all of the things that we've been doing in our own lives as activists, but now we have to do them on the general political platform.
I'd never been in a political party before in my life. It wasn't politics, it was peace that I wanted.
We had to prove that it wasn't about sitting around a table and just talking about women's issues. It was about basic human rights issues for the whole of Northern Ireland.
পরে যখন আমার নাম এসছে তো আমার হাজবেন্ড একদমই রাজি না।
আসলে শান্তি রক্ষা কথাটা তো ব্যাপক।
বাঙালি নারী হিসেবে যে বাংলাদেশের দৃষ্টিভঙ্গি পরিবর্তন করতে পেরেছি, যে আমরা নারীরাও সেবামূলক কাজ করতে পারি।
আমার সবই আমার ভিতরে থাকতে হবে, মার মায়া মমতাও থাকতে হবে, এবং আমি পুলিশ সৈনিক যে আমার সে দৃঢ়তাও থাকতে হবে।
أكثر فترة حسيت حالي فيها حرة بداية الانتفاضة.
هذا الإطار النسوي كان هو للعلن عمل اجتماعي اللي هو الروضات، المشاغل الخياطة، تعليم النساء التريح، هذا كان اللي للعلن. بس هو في الحقيقة في الباطن هو كان تنظيم بحت.
النضال النسوي جنبا إلى جنب مع النضال الوطني، الحرية هي حرية واحدة.
Right. Okay, so, lights up. All right. Okay, all right. So save the date, everybody, March 25th and 26th, 2019. And there are going to be many opportunities to work together to strategically use the new series in our collective women, peace, and security work. And my team has even spoken, with some of you over the past year about those opportunities. I hope over the course of the day and during the breaks, we can talk more about the series and what writing women into the narrative looks like for each of you. And to provide a framework for thinking about that question in a practical way, I want to share a quote from former Ambassador Milan Verveer, who I know many of us know. Reflecting on the first series, Milan said, quote, "When Women, War and Peace aired on national public television, it was the first time the idea was put forward into mainstream media that the full participation of women in public life is essential to building strong, vibrant democracies in the United States and internationally. The series made this concept relatable and urgent, and it changed the way women's participation and rights are talked about around the world." And I share this quote because it's this idea of using human stories to make concepts relatable and urgent that will be core to the work we do together in March when Women, War and Peace broadcasts. And beyond this series, it needs to be at the heart of all of our work in the women, peace, and security community. I believe it's never been more urgent. The Women, Peace, and Security Act passed last year. It was a bipartisan piece of legislation, and a policy window has opened up. Even as there's backlash, we're getting closer to a tipping point. This is an opportune moment to put all of our best strategies on the table. To some people in this room, that might mean stats and data, and that's good because we need evidence and we need rational arguments. What I want to ask is, how can those stats be deployed in the service of story? The Women, Peace, and Security agenda can sometimes feel broad and unwieldy. It encompasses a lot of ideas and truths, and as we all know, sometimes there's even disagreement in the community about where the focus of the agenda should be. Is it about the inclusion of women in peace processes? Is it about women's political representation? Is it about human security? These are valuable debates. But we also need moments when we're focusing on the stories, the emotions, ideas, and the individual truths they hold. A story can be an effective way to present these truths alongside one another and have them coexist and intersect in a way that can be very complicated to do in writing. These true stories point to bigger truths. And it's not just about using stories in our work like these films or video interviews, long-form articles, interactive websites. That's part of it. It's also understanding how to tell the story of our work and how to connect our story and our content with the right people in a meaningful way, whether they're readers, students, policymakers, peace builders, community members. When I'm asked what it means to do social impact storytelling work, I often ask people to visualize a time they were in a movie theater or at home and you interacted with a story, maybe a film that really moved you. You were angry, you felt gut punched, maybe you were inspired and you felt hope. The lights turned on, maybe the credits rolled. You continued to think about what you saw or read for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes at most, and then you go back to your life. Our job at Peace is Loud is to harness the potential of that moment, that energy you feel when you're moved by a story, and help turn it into something actionable and lasting. And I know that there are so many people in this room who are looking to make lasting impact, to move the needle. So it's in that spirit that I want to share some lessons that I've learned from my past decade of doing storytelling work, because storytelling has an extremely important role to play at this moment for all of us. So the first of 5 lessons, define impact. So when I meet with filmmakers, I always tell them, make sure the style of your film lends itself to the impact you're trying to have, and be really clear what that impact is. Not every film or story needs to change public policy. And if your film or story isn't made to do that, it doesn't mean you can't have impact. You can tell a story that changes hearts and minds and raises public awareness, and that's really significant too. That's part of culture change. It's a slow burn. And just because it isn't always quantifiable, it doesn't mean it can't be measurable, strategic, and focused. We need to be just as smart about the way we do culture change as we do policy change, maybe even more so. And I think this is so important in the work we're doing in the women, peace, and security field. So I'll give you an example. For the first Women, War, and Peace series that broadcasted, one of our campaign goals was to change the way women were represented in media coverage about war and peace. We wanted the series and the campaign we were doing to begin to shift the dominant narrative. And that's a big goal, right? How do we know we're on the right track? What we did was we worked with computer scientists to use data mining and network analysis to determine whether the release of the films changed media discourse on the topic of women, war, and peace. This type of computational analysis is pretty unique in the documentary film field, but it's so important because when you're looking at change in media discourse, it really helps to paint the picture of how it's actually happening. And what the analysis showed us leading up to the release of the film and after the release, over a 6-month period, was that there was a significant increase in the coverage of women from stories of women as solely victims in need of protection to stories of women as actors, negotiators, human rights defenders, and witnesses. We're building on this work with a new series, partnering with the incredible team at Fuller Project on international reporting to publish a steady drumbeat of reporting on women in peace building. So the new series comes out in a media landscape that's populated with stories that reinforce the themes and messages in the series and that bring women's voices and perspectives to bear. And thanks to Compton Foundation, local PBS stations across the country are producing accompanying television, radio, and online content for the series that focuses on local women's movements in their cities, tying that local work to the global women's movement and the movements on screen. We'll also be staging Wikipedia hackathons. I don't know if you know, but only 17% of Wikipedia's biographical entries are written about women, and less than 20% of contributors are women. So history is literally being written by and about men. So we're going to use the broadcasts to gather women across the country to create new biographical entries for women peace builders and to solicit the names of women who audiences think need to be written into history, who have been left out. I give these examples because this is all about increasing representation and shifting the narrative. And that's the culture change work. It can be difficult to prove a causal relationship between what you do and what you achieve, and the results aren't like as immediate and maybe not as neatly packaged for funders, but I would argue that it's as crucial as the legislative advocacy and policy work that we do with our films at Peace is Loud. And when you're doing culture change work, you can still be really clear about who your targets are and what the unique strategies are for reaching those specific audiences. In fact, I think you must be really clear about that always, which brings me to my second lesson. Know your audience. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, over 13 million people saw our Women, War, and Peace series when it broadcast on public television in the US. And that's not coastal markets, that's all across the country. This is part of why we chose to again broadcast on PBS with the new series rather than HBO or Amazon. Over the course of a year, 86% of all US television households watch PBS, and the demographic breakdown reflects the overall US population with respect to race, ethnicity, education, income. As you heard from Milan Verveer's quote earlier, we saw that our Women, War, and Peace films could popularize and translate women, peace, and security issues to the general public who aren't well versed in the issues. And speaking of the US specifically, I think that's really important because it's the general public who are the constituents that put pressure on policymakers and politicians to change the way they legislate. So the broader audience is critically important to effective policy implementation. It's not just the experts and the policymakers. But when you're building an impact strategy, which goes beyond the marketing and the outreach, you're not just trying to reach any audience, you're trying to reach the right audience. And in those cases, I say, there is no such thing as the general public. It's essential to understand who your audience is and the levers of influence. As we all know, very often, the gatekeepers and decision makers are most influenced by the will of their constituents, the voters. So which districts have congressional members sitting on the committees that are going to receive the Women, Peace, and Security Act implementation reports from the White House? Who are the voters in those districts? Do they know what the Women, Peace, and Security Act is? If they did, what would change? What leverage do they have? How can our work and our stories reach those people? And we need to ask that question from the perspective of the target audience. Once you figure out who that target audience is, be absolutely vigilant about strategy. When you're distributing your content, whether it's a policy brief, a video series, a new web interactive, your research, do not throw everything up against the wall to see what sticks. Basic campaign skills training can go a really long way. Having clear measurable goals, strategies, distinct tactics, it's really important. An event to deliver a policy brief isn't necessarily a goal. It's a tactic that's part of a strategy to meet your goal. And social change takes time. You have to be nimble and pivot when strategies don't work. Constantly refine your messaging for different audiences and be consistent with that across all of your platforms of distribution, online and on the ground. You may not always be able to prove that causal relationship, but I promise you that if you take a focused approach, you're going to be much more impactful with your work. We have a lot of filmmakers who say to us, we want to get this film out to everybody. It's such an important story, it's a universal story. And to that we say, yes, it is. It would be really great to reach everyone, but it's not going to happen. And even if our budget was 1,000,000 times the size it is, our job is to convince the filmmakers that it's a bad idea to try to reach everyone, because the results will not be satisfying. Being focused does not mean lacking ambition. I would say it's actually the opposite. My third lesson, there are only 5, don't worry. Okay. My third lesson, find the right messenger. So once you know your audience, it's really important to understand who is best positioned to deliver your message. I very much believe that the choir needs new songs. They should never be taken for granted, but many of us try with our work to reach beyond the choir, outside of our own communities, because that can often be where the greatest impact lies. If your audience is beyond the choir, you need an ambassador from within the community you're targeting who is going to be your champion. We worked on a film called The Armor of Light that takes on the issue of evangelicals and their love affair with guns and the inconsistency with being pro-life and pro-gun. We were trying to take the film into very insular evangelical communities and churches to have a dialogue on guns. The only way this happened was having prominent evangelical ministers as ambassadors who lended credibility to the work. They were the face of the campaign, and our names were nowhere to be found. And it wasn't about that for us. It wasn't about taking the credit for what was being accomplished. It was about doing what needed to be done to reach the audience. To give an example of knowing your messenger in the women, peace, and security community, at Peace is Loud, we've seen different military schools and academies successfully use our films in their trainings, in their classrooms, and it's very important to us that they guide the process. They know the language best, they know the needs. I spoke at the Naval War College back in 2015, and shortly after that, the National Defense University screened all of the Women, War, and Peace films. And here is what one of the professors wrote to us after that. He said, quote, "The screenings have been an important part of expanding the Eisenhower School curriculum regarding women, peace, and security issues. The films have been the centerpiece of a monthly film series on women, peace, and security. One key result has been the decision to offer a 12-week elective course this spring on women, peace, and security, which will be the first ever for National Defense University. Most importantly, this has been a student-driven process that has increased awareness of the importance of women, peace, and security issues." So here we have National Defense University, a premier institute of higher education funded by the US Department of Defense, intended to facilitate the high-level development of the country's national security strategy, chartered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And here was their first ever course on women, peace, and security, and it was a student-driven process that used storytelling. So we listened to this and we wondered, can we work with other international relations and national security grad programs to use these films to build support among students, faculty, administrators, to create gender courses and gender analysis specializations where they are not currently offered? So supported by Compton Foundation and Our Secure Future, we held a Women, Peace, and Security Curriculum Consortium at the Naval War College last year. I know a few of you were there. We brought together 30 experts and thought leaders from across US civilian and military learning institutions. They shared strategies that they've seen as highly effective in moving the women, peace, and security agenda forward in academic and professional training settings, including the importance of students initiating and leading. We created a policy brief out of that gathering, which is available online, and we'll be holding another gathering at the Canadian Defense Academy next year. The work that comes out of these consortiums are informing a screenings program we're developing at graduate programs for the second Women, War, and Peace series that will be spearheaded by students to scale up gender analysis, insecurity, and international relations coursework. Right now, we're identifying those programs, so please talk to me if you know of a program that you think should be represented in the screening series. Lesson number 4. Okay. Lesson number 4 is listen actively and often. I think the example I just gave is it's a good example of the power of listening, you know, understanding what might be needed at universities to get the buy-in. And this might seem obvious, but I believe it's what makes good work really great when it comes to impact. Listening is such a crucial part of partnership building, and it should be a full-time job if it's done right. For Peace is Loud, if we really want to know how our film is going to advance the work of the people and organizations in the communities most affected by the issues in our film, we really spend the time with those people and organizations. Understand what's useful for them, listen to what they're doing and what they need. Don't just ask them to do something for you. Be willing to work with partners to adapt your content for their use. It's a heavier lift, but it's going to get you so much further to achieving the goals you've set out for yourself. As I shared earlier, representation really matters. Believe that the people who have been most affected by the issues are the ones best positioned to solve them. Let them lead, but that doesn't mean you sit back and make them do all the work. It has to be mutually beneficial. So examples from Women, War, and Peace. We heard early on from the networks of women peace builders that we were in touch with that the films were going to be really valuable tools for them to integrate into ongoing trainings they were already doing to advocate for country national action plans and for more effective implementation of 1325. But literacy was a problem. It was going to be a barrier. They couldn't use the films because the subtitles were in English. So we dubbed the films into multiple languages and created a screening kit with all of those dubbed versions. This was 6 years ago, And in 2018, these kits are still being used in Uganda, Kenya, the DRC, South Sudan, and Burundi to advocate for inclusive peace and security processes. So ask yourself that question when you're creating a new piece of content. How can this be most helpful in advancing the work that is already happening in the field? How can we be sure we're not making a decision in a silo? Another example we've heard over the years from many of our partners is that there's a real need for a short 15 to 20-minute version of Women, War, and Peace, something that can be used by policymakers and practitioners who work on peace and security issues. So with our colleague Maria O'Reilly, we're now editing exactly this, a short reel that combines scenes from the new series and the first series, and this reel will hopefully be well positioned for use by our partners who are working with US government staff tasked with implementing the WPS Act, UN mediators and staff working on peace processes, and national governments who are being briefed on the importance of 1325. And now for my last lesson. Have an exit strategy. So when designing a new interactive or shooting a video, distributing research, think of an exit strategy from the beginning. I've seen so many organizations that do incredible work that build these very unique audiences for their issue, for their research. They mobilize the audience, they start great initiatives and projects, and then the funding runs out after about a year or two, and the work dies. The social media pages lay dormant for years, the website domain expires. How many of you have ever experienced this? Yeah, people, yep. And so really think about building projects that can potentially be absorbed into the infrastructure of another organization, or that can be taken on by other individuals working in this space once your capacity runs dry. I think this is so important in the women, peace, and security space where funding is a real challenge. As a community, how can we weave a web of interdependence and complementary work instead of competition and a trail of abandoned initiatives? So I'm calling on all of us to roll up our sleeves, whether you're sitting at the table, on the periphery, whatever stage of your career you're in, with a chicken on your lap or under the chair. Ask yourself, we have the legislation. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation, a significant achievement for our field. What now? What will we do with it? What we know from the record of implementing 1325 is that policies and frameworks, they aren't enough. What's needed is a cultural shift. Culture with a big C and with a little c. Change in the way citizens think about war and peace and how they hold their legislators accountable as a result. Change in the culture of government agencies, institutions, think tanks, armies, universities, nonprofits, and news institutions. And this is where storytelling strength lies. To the academics in the audience, I refer you to organizations like Experiential Communications that works with academics to translate key messages and research findings to the public. I also refer you to a great article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called "Should Academics Talk to Katie Couric?" Not surprisingly, the answer they give is yes, you should talk to Katie Couric. And just a few of the tips they give. Think stories. What's the headline? Are there ways to make your work more responsive to the outside world? What are the news hooks you can hang your research on without dumbing it down? Can you advocate your schools to offer training to faculty on speaking and writing for broad public constituencies? Writing for the public may force you to work in unfamiliar ways to unlearn a lot of what you know, but why not give it a try? You may find there's a much larger audience for your research than you know. In his book, The Righteous Mind, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt explains that if you want to change someone's mind about a moral or political issue, you have to talk to their intuition first. The science shows that despite all of our emphasis on rationality, when it comes to changing mind, intuition comes first, strategic reasoning second. Storytelling and human connection speak to our intuition. They speak to the gut feelings that drive us, and they can interrupt our rapid, unthinking judgments for just long enough to let some light in. And that's where reasoning, argument, and evidence can play their most powerful role. Reasoning matters, but the processes of intuition are where most of the action is in the way our moral psychology plays out. And I believe that women's participation in the decisions that affect their lives, this is one of the most important moral challenges of our time. So we need research, we need evidence, we need arguments, but we also need, I would argue we especially need stories. Real, compelling human stories that illustrate the individual truths as well as the bigger picture. that contribute more tiles to the mosaic of what peace and security looks like for society as a whole. And what is the field of women, peace, and security, if not highlighting that there are many more perspectives on war and peace than we are currently capturing? And by including more people's perspectives, diverse perspectives and insights, we're more likely to create more robust peace and security for everyone. Thank you. No questions? Please, yes.
I was really struck by what you said about the fact that there was no footage.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, as a result of the chicken dinner, or is there, is there any attempt to get the journalists, the photographers, the videographers that are covering war zones to look at the pathetic women and make sure that they have some footage of the people who are actually trying to make peace? What kind of change have you seen there, if any?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and that's exactly what we're trying to do with these dinners. We're going to be doing another one in DC in January. This one was in New York, and we'll be doing 3 more over the course of next year. We're really trying to make inroads, and I will say one of the great things that came out of that first dinner in the hour when people were lingering, after the meal, were people wanted story ideas. They really wanted stories. About a week later, one of my colleagues ran into one of the editors who was at the dinner and asked him, so what did you really think? What did you think about the conversation? He's from a prominent magazine in the US, and he said, I thought it was great. He said, honestly, I've never thought about covering war from a women's perspective. And, and I think he's somebody who would consider himself a feminist, a progressive person. It just actually hadn't occurred to him before. So I think those are the moments that we need and that we're going to try to create with these dinners moving forward. Any other questions? Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. 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 Yeah, absolutely. So with the first Women, War, and Peace series, there was high school curriculum that went along with the series, and it was part of PBS Learning Media, which is accessed by, I think it's something like 98% of high school classrooms. We also go to a lot of conferences where high school teachers are, so NCSS and NCTE, and we offer the films and the curriculum, usually free of charge, to exactly do that, to get the films into classrooms. So yes, we will have high school materials with this new series.